When Melania Trump dragged Jasmine Crockett into court with a defamation lawsuit, no one expected the trial to explode into a public drama. But that's exactly what happened, and it all shifted in less than 10 seconds when one witness dropped a truth bomb that flipped everything upside down. The second that headline hit, First Lady Melania Trump sues Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, Washington felt like it was shaking. It wasn't whispers, it wasn't rumors, it was a real legal filing with Melania's name stamped bold across the top. For most Americans, the only question was not if this would cause chaos, but how big the storm would get. Think about it. A former First Lady, someone usually quiet and out of the mudslinging, stepping into the ring to take on a rising Democrat in open court. Just that fact alone guaranteed flashing cameras, news vans outside the courthouse, and endless TV pundits arguing over what it meant. But what made jaws hit the floor was the reason for the case. This wasn't about Congress or policy or bills. It was about words. Words Jasmine Crockett had spoken. Words sharp enough and direct enough that Melania's lawyers claimed they crossed into defamation. And in today's world, where a single line can be clipped, posted, and replayed millions of times in minutes, the stakes couldn't be higher. It all began at a Dallas courthouse one muggy morning, the Texas heat hanging thick in the air. That didn't stop the crowd. Protesters with hand-painted signs pressed shoulder to shoulder against Trump supporters draped in flags. Reporters leaned across barricades, shouting questions at anyone who looked like a lawyer. "This doesn't feel like just a trial," one woman whispered to her friend while clutching an iced coffee. "It feels like history." Inside, the benches groaned under the weight of journalists, law professors, and everyday people who somehow managed to squeeze in. And there they were, two women who couldn't be more different. Melania, elegant, reserved, each move measured. Jasmine, fiery, unapologetic, eyes daring anyone to quiet her. Mrs. Trump versus Congresswoman Crockett. When the clerk called the case, the room snapped into silence. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was about image, legacy, and pride. To see why it mattered so much, you have to understand who Jasmine Crockett is. She's not the type to sugarcoat or play safe. A freshman Democrat from Texas, she built her reputation by throwing punches with words, grilling opponents, clapping back, and speaking for the ignored. She doesn't whisper, she projects. That's how she rose so fast. And maybe that's exactly why someone as private as Melania Trump decided to take the extraordinary risk of suing her. But lawsuits are never clean. Melania's team argued that Crockett's comments went beyond politics, that she implied things about Melania's role in shady financial dealings. Allegations serious enough, they claimed, to damage reputations and demand legal consequences. To Melania's fans, this case was about defending dignity. To Jasmine's supporters, it was about silencing a woman who had rattled the White House. The cameras went wild when the attorneys walked in. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every scrap of detail. The shade of Melania's dress, the tilt of Jasmine's chin, even how they adjusted in their seats. Because everyone understood this wasn't just law, it was theater. Jasmine leaned in to whisper something to her lawyer, earning a quick nod. Melania sat still, face unreadable, but her knuckles tightened around the pen in her hand. These women weren't just separated by political parties, they were separated by style. Melania's power came from restraint, speaking rarely and softly. Jasmine's power came from being loud and unshaken, her very presence challenging the old rules of power. And even in the first few minutes of that day, one thing was already obvious. No matter who won, neither woman would walk out unchanged. Reputations would be tested, secrets teased, and the nation would be glued to every second. Outside, chants rose louder, Trump fans yelling that Crockett was reckless, Crockett's backers shouting back about courage. Police lined the courthouse steps, keeping the tension from exploding into chaos. But inside, in that wooden room, the silence between arguments was deafening. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't really about a defamation lawsuit. This was truth versus spin. Bravery versus control. The dangerous gamble of putting words on trial. And before the first arguments were even spoken, the question was already hanging heavy. Who would leave this courtroom stronger? And who would leave with their legacy cracked. To answer that, you had to know who Jasmine Crockett really was. Not the headlines, not the sound bites, the story behind the firebrand. Long before she sparred with Melania Trump in a courtroom, Jasmine had been fighting in Dallas courtrooms as a defense attorney. She made her name taking on the cases nobody else wanted. Poor families, people without connections, clients other lawyers brushed off. She was the lawyer who answered frantic late-night calls from worried mothers or scared fathers, the one who showed up when nobody else would. She never walked away from a tough case, recalled Andre Phillips, a local activist who had worked with her years earlier. She wasn't afraid of judges, prosecutors, anybody. She looked them straight in the eye and told the truth, even if it stung. That blunt honesty, fearless and sharp, was what carried her into politics. When Jasmine ran for Congress, plenty assumed she'd mellow once she got to D.C. Play nice, play the game, but she didn't. If anything, her voice only got louder. In hearings, in interviews, and all over social media. She became known for refusing to let anyone cut her off, for clapping back when someone tried to minimize her. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who told her, "We don't have a voice up there." That refusal to bow to etiquette made her enemies. Lobbyists rolled their eyes, career politicians scoffed. Conservative media painted her as reckless. Progressives called her a breath of fresh air. And through it all, Jasmine never flinched. So when she made pointed remarks hinting at Melania Trump's role in certain Trump-era dealings, nobody was surprised at her boldness. What shocked people was Melania's reaction. Instead of brushing it off as noise, the First Lady struck back in court. "Why her?" one reporter asked on a morning show. "Why Jasmine? Out of all the critics the Trumps have faced, why single out this Congresswoman?" That question lingered because Jasmine Crockett wasn't the most famous Democrat. She didn't chair committees. She wasn't running for president. Yet somehow she'd hit a nerve so deep that Melania Trump, the woman known for silence, had decided to fight. Taking Jasmine Crockett to court wasn't just about a lawsuit. It was about fearlessness versus control. Jasmine wasn't the type you could scare with legal threats. If anything, lawsuits made her even bolder. And that was dangerous for someone like Melania, who had spent years building a public image around elegance, distance, and staying above the noise. Jasmine was the total opposite, raw, blunt, and unapologetic. For millions watching, it wasn't just two women clashing in court. It was two very different Americas colliding. On one side, a congresswoman who clawed her way up from modest beginnings, hustled through law school, and built her career by speaking unfiltered truths. On the other, a first lady with worldwide recognition, her name tied to wealth, power, and a carefully polished image. When the lawsuit was announced, Jasmine didn't back down. In fact, she leaned in harder. Standing outside her Dallas district office, she looked straight into the cameras and said, "If speaking truth about power puts me in court, then that's exactly where I belong. I don't run, I don't hide." That clip played on repeat across every news network. Supporters cheered her courage. Critics rolled their eyes, calling it arrogance. But nobody could deny one thing: Jasmine wasn't scared. And that fearlessness, that refusal to bend, was what made her so powerful to her base, so dangerous to her opponents, and what turned this lawsuit into a test of survival. Could a woman who made her name speaking truth to power withstand a direct strike from one of the most protected figures in the country? Behind the cameras, though, her staff saw the toll. Long nights in her office, legal briefs stacked high, Jasmine pressing her fingers to her temples as she whispered to an aide, "They want to break me. But if I bend now, I'll never be able to stand again." This fight wasn't just about clearing her name. For Jasmine, it was about survival, not just political, but personal. Losing could brand her reckless forever. Winning would prove even the First Lady couldn't shut her down. While Jasmine's fire dominated headlines, everyone asked the bigger question: why would Melania risk everything by suing in the first place? For years, she had built a brand on silence. While Donald grabbed headlines and stirred chaos, Melania stayed in the background. Words rare, appearances calculated, her image carefully guarded. So when the news broke that she was suing a sitting congresswoman, shockwaves. It wasn't just unusual, it was historic. No modern First Lady had ever hauled a member of Congress into court over defamation. Why now?
Why Jasmine? Behind the designer gowns and flawless photos, Melania's world had always been more fragile than it looked. Being First Lady wasn't just glamour. It meant constant scrutiny, her life dissected at every turn. She'd built a shell, a mystique, but Crockett's remarks had pierced it. Melania's lawyers argued Jasmine hadn't just criticized her politically, she'd implied involvement in shady behind-the-scenes dealings that could permanently stain her reputation. For someone who spent years cultivating elegance and distance from chaos, those words weren't just insults. They were dangerous. She's not protecting her husband here, one legal analyst explained on CBS. She's protecting herself. This case is about her dignity. Inside the East Wing, her advisors had debated for weeks. Some warned it would only give Crockett a bigger spotlight. Others argued silence would look like weakness. In the end, Melania herself decided, "I will not let lies stand." She reportedly snapped to an aide, her voice sharp, more forceful than usual. It was a decision with massive risk. By suing, she opened herself up to depositions, cross-examinations, and the press digging into her past, things she'd worked years to avoid. But Melania wasn't acting on impulse. She believed this trial could be her moment to show strength on her own terms. Supporters cheered her decision. At rallies in Texas and Florida, women waved signs saying, "Protect Melania's dignity." Conservative commentators praised her for finally fighting back. Even critics admitted, bold move. But boldness cuts both ways. For Jasmine, this lawsuit was like a gift. "You've just handed her a microphone," said political strategist Karen Villarreal on MSNBC. And it was true. Now Crockett didn't need to fight for airtime. The case guaranteed her a spotlight every single day. Melania wasn't new to risk. She had weathered scandals before, staying calm when others cracked. She trusted her team to handle Crockett. But lawsuits have a way of slipping out of control. Judges make rulings, witnesses reveal secrets, reporters dig in places you'd never expect. By suing Jasmine, Melania wasn't just defending her image, she was gambling with it. Inside the Dallas courtroom, her lawyers spoke in steady tones, calling Crockett's remarks reckless slander that blurred the line between truth and lies. They pointed to Jasmine's fiery style, her history of throwing barbed comments. "This is not politics," Melania's lead attorney declared. "It is about accountability. It is about protecting the integrity of the First Lady of the United States." Melania herself stayed mostly quiet, her face blank, only occasionally scribbling notes and sliding them to her lawyer. Observers called her demeanor icy calm, a sharp contrast to the buzz swirling around her. For a moment, it seemed like the case might hold. The arguments were neat, the legal footing steady. But cracks were already forming, because defamation cases always carry one burden: proof. And proof demands evidence, documents, testimony, context. Jasmine's team knew that. They didn't just prepare a defense, they built an offense. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, chatter never stopped. Some commentators insisted Melania's lawsuit was pure personal pride. Others said it was a distraction from bigger controversies brewing in Washington. A late-night comedian quipped, "When the First Lady sues a congresswoman, that's not called defamation, that's called ratings." Yet beneath the jokes, a deeper truth lingered. Melania had always been a symbol of elegance and restraint. By suing Jasmine Crockett, she was trying to reshape herself as someone who wouldn't be pushed around. But symbols are fragile, and when they crack, they don't just bend, they shatter. Reporters camping outside the Dallas courthouse knew they were witnessing history. This wasn't just law. It was a collision of personalities, reputations, and the very idea of who gets to decide truth in America.
For Melania, the gamble was massive. For Jasmine, the opportunity was golden. But if Melania thought airtight legal arguments alone could carry the day, she was about to learn something. Court cases aren't won just by lawyers. They're won by moments. And one moment, in particular, was about to flip this trial upside down. Dallas's Earl Cable Federal Building had seen plenty of big trials before, but nothing like this. From the moment the sun rose, the courthouse looked less like a place of justice and more like the stage for a national showdown. By mid-morning, the courthouse no longer felt like a place for justice. It looked like the center of a national circus. Satellite trucks lined the street, reporters from Los Angeles to Miami shoved each other for camera spots, and a group of college kids from Southern Methodist University had even camped overnight just to brag they were there. Inside, the air conditioning hummed against the Texas heat, but it barely cut through the heavy tension. The smell of cheap coffee clung to the hands of exhausted reporters who hadn't slept properly in days. Everyone leaned forward,
waiting for the gavel. In the front row, Melania Trump sat tall, beige suit sharp, hair pinned into a perfect wave. Every movement, adjusting her pen, lifting her glass of water, looked practiced, deliberate, controlled. A few feet away, Jasmine Crockett gave off a completely different energy. She leaned toward her lawyer, flipping through notes, whispering quick comments. Unlike Melania's poker face, Jasmine's expressions shifted constantly. Irritation at a loud camera click, a grin at an aide's joke, steel in her eyes whenever she glanced at Melania's table. "They won't even look at each other," one reporter whispered. Then the judge strode in. Tall, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses. "Court is now in session," he announced, voice steady, but aware this wasn't any ordinary case. Melania's lead attorney, Philip Ransom, stood first. His voice was smooth, almost theatrical, crafted as much for TV cameras as for the jury. "This case is simple," he said. "Representative Crockett crossed the line. She didn't just critique policy, she accused the First Lady of misconduct with zero evidence. These words were broadcast, repeated, and believed by millions. That is not politics. That is defamation." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jasmine scribbled something and slid it to her attorney, Linda Garvey, who smirked before tucking it away. Then Garvey arose, her steps sharp, her voice slicing the air. "This trial isn't about dignity. It's about silencing dissent. My client spoke on influence, accountability, transparency, the things leaders should be held to. Mrs. Trump may not like hearing it, but dislike isn't defamation. Truth isn't defamation. And punishing a member of Congress for doing her job sets a dangerous precedent." As Garvey spoke, Jasmine locked eyes with a juror in the front row, a middle-aged woman furiously scribbling in her notebook. The atmosphere grew heavier, every word now aimed at both the 12 jurors and the millions following on TV and social media. "This is going to be the trial of the decade," muttered a Dallas Morning News reporter, typing fast. Behind them, spectators whispered. A man in a worn baseball cap leaned close to his wife. "I don't care what side you're on. Watching a First Lady sue a Congresswoman? That's wild." During a recess, Jasmine stood near the defense table, sipping water. "Congresswoman, do you regret your comments?" a reporter shouted. She didn't even pause. "Regret?" she replied, voice carrying across the room. "The only thing I regret is how fragile the truth seems to be for some people." The remark drew chuckles from her backers and scowls from Melania's team. Back in session, witnesses were called. A political consultant described how Jasmine's remarks had ricocheted across networks. Melania's lawyers stressed the harm to her reputation. Jasmine's team countered, "Public figures live in the spotlight, and criticism comes with the job." By afternoon, even the judge seemed to sense this wasn't just about defamation law. It had turned into a battle over free speech itself. When tempers flared, he slammed his gavel. "Control yourselves," he barked, though it barely cooled the room. No cameras were allowed inside, but sketch artists scrambled to capture every detail. One drawing showed Jasmine leaning forward, finger pointed sharp across the table, while Melania stared ahead, lips pressed tight. By the end of the first day, the air in the courtroom was heavier than when it started. Both sides had drawn their lines. Neither woman had blinked. And though the first blows had just been exchanged, everyone knew this would be a fight America had never seen before. But the true turning point wasn't in the openings. It was coming in the evidence, where Jasmine's defense had its sharpest weapons waiting. The second morning, the rhythm felt familiar. Reporters sprinted up courthouse steps before sunrise, phones in one hand, laptops in the other. Security stretched around the block. Inside, seats filled fast with aides, students, and Texans who had never before seen a First Lady in person. When the judge nodded, Philip Ransom rose again, deliberate, confident, navy suit crisp despite the Dallas humidity. His voice boomed with a polish earned over decades in court. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "words have consequences. This is not about politics. It is about reputation. It is about truth. Representative Crockett accused the First Lady of things with no basis in fact. These weren't throwaway remarks. They were accusations, broadcast and amplified to millions. And those words caused real damage." He paused, letting silence press on the room. Then, "The First Lady is not here as a politician. She is here as a woman, a wife, a mother whose name has been dragged through the mud. We ask you to hold Representative Crockett accountable." The jury scribbled, stone-faced. Behind them, journalists typed furiously. Melania sat with hands folded, face expressionless, occasionally leaning in to whisper something to Ransom. Then came the first witness, Simon Leary, a media analyst from Arizona. With graphs and charts, he showed how Jasmine's comments were clipped, shared, and replayed thousands of times. These comments didn't stay in Washington, Leary explained. They spread nationwide. Every replay magnified the damage to the First Lady's image. In your expert opinion, Ransom asked, did Representative Crockett's statements change how Americans saw the First Lady? Yes, Leary said firmly. They painted her in a damaging, misleading light. The jurors scribbled faster. Jasmine tapped her pen against the desk, eyes locked on Leary like a blade. Then came the first witness, Dana Mercer, a PR consultant from Phoenix. She explained how reputational damage ripples outward, lost opportunities, strained relationships, doors closing. Even when false stories are corrected, the damage sticks. That's how public perception works. Ransom turned toward the jury. This isn't about policy disagreements. This is about reckless words aimed at a person, and that person is sitting right here. He gestured toward Melania. For the first time since the trial began, Melania lifted her eyes toward the jurors. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Melania just looked at the jurors, a steady gaze that carried both strength and a hint of fragility. But once the cross-examination started, cracks began to show. Jasmine's lawyer, Linda Garvey, rose smoothly. Mr. Leary, she began, voice calm but sharp. You testified that Representative Crockett's words spread quickly across the country? That's correct, Leary replied. Would you also agree that the First Lady is already one of the most scrutinized women in the world? Leary hesitated, then said yes. And would you agree that public figures are subject to criticism, sometimes very harsh criticism, simply because of their roles? Yes. So what you're really saying, Garvey pressed, is not that Representative Crockett created scrutiny, but that she added to a cycle of criticism that already existed. Ransom jumped up to object, but the judge waved it through. Leary shifted in his chair. That's one way of looking at it, yes. The jurors exchanged glances. Reporters typed faster. Garvey moved on to the PR consultant, Mercer. You talked about reputational damage, she said. But tell me, if a statement is true, is it still defamation? No, Mercer admitted. And who decides if something is true or false? That would be for the court to decide. Garvey smiled faintly. Exactly the answer she wanted. She sat down, and the momentum in the room tilted. Melania's case had begun strong, but Crockett's team had just poked visible holes in it. During the lunch break, chaos spilled onto the courthouse steps. Reporters shoved microphones everywhere. One journalist from the Texas Tribune asked the blunt question, if Melania wins, does that mean every member of Congress has to watch their words? Or does it just mean she's shielding herself from lies? Where's the line? Inside, Melania sat quietly. Her lawyers huddled close. Across the room, Jasmine laughed with her team, the sound carrying over like two worlds colliding, one stiff with silence, the other buzzing with defiance. By the end of the day, jurors had heard the core of Melania's argument. Words matter, reputations matter, and Jasmine's remarks had real consequences. But what nobody could guess was how fast the balance of power would swing once Jasmine's side took over. When it was the defense's turn, they didn't just walk in ready to respond. They came to flip the script entirely. By then, the trial had already been framed in the media as free speech versus reputation. Jasmine sat arms folded, calm but buzzing like a fighter waiting for the bell. Garvey rose with a heavy binder, but didn't even look at it. Her opening words cut sharp. This case isn't about protecting dignity. It's about silencing a voice that asks tough questions, a voice that speaks truth about power. She turned to the juror. Representative Crockett didn't invent anything. She said what millions of Americans were already wondering. And now the First Lady wants to punish her for saying it out loud. A ripple ran through the gallery. Jasmine's eyes found a juror in the back row leaning forward. And though she didn't smile, her gaze said it clearly. I'm not afraid to be here. Garvey's first witness was Dr. Anthony Ward, a political historian from the University of Texas. Democracy depends on scrutiny, he explained. Public criticism of leaders is not just allowed, it's expected. If we punish representatives for questioning those in power, we weaken the system itself. Ransom shot up. Dr. Ward, are you saying public officials can say whatever they want, no matter how damaging, without accountability? Ward didn't blink. I'm saying that if accountability means silencing dissent, then we risk losing something far greater than reputation. Jasmine leaned over to Garvey and whispered, that's the line right there. Garvey nodded. Next came Angela Moreno, a community organizer from Fort Worth. She's always been our voice, Angela testified, pointing at Jasmine. She says the things we're too afraid to say. If she gets sued for that, what chance do the rest of us have? Ransom tried to strike the comment as irrelevant, but the judge let it stand. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Jasmine Crockett herself took the stand. The room fell silent as she walked to the chair, placed her hand on the Bible, and sat down. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. "Congresswoman," Garvey began, "why did you make the comments that led to this lawsuit?" Jasmine's voice was steady. "Because the American people deserve transparency. Because when you see patterns of influence, you don't stay silent. And because being in Congress isn't about shielding the powerful. It's about protecting the people who sent me here." Garvey let the silence hang. "Did you intend to harm the First Lady personally?" "No," Jasmine said firmly. "I intended to shine light where too many preferred darkness. If that's considered harm, then maybe we should question what exactly we're protecting in this country." Ransom stepped up for cross-examination, adjusting his tie. "Congresswoman, you understand the weight of your words." "I do, and you admit your comment suggested Mrs. Trump was involved in questionable dealings." "I admit I raised questions. Questions based on patterns the public has seen." "So you had no direct evidence?" Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low but sharp. "Evidence doesn't drop out of thin air, Mr. Ransom. Sometimes it takes someone asking the uncomfortable question to bring it into the light." The jurors' eyes flicked between them. "So you're saying you made damaging statements without proof?" Ransom pressed. "I'm saying I did my job, and if doing my job upsets powerful people, so be it." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order!" Jasmine sat back, chin high, unbothered. She wasn't just defending herself, she was making it clear this trial was about something bigger. Free speech itself. When the defense closed, Garvey faced the jury. "You've heard my client. You've heard the experts. This isn't reckless talk. This is representation. And if we punish it, we punish democracy itself." Reporters bolted for the exits, racing deadlines. Headlines blazed across Twitter. "Crockett fights back. I did my job." Clips of her cross-examination ran on cable news in a loop, pundits debating whether she was fearless or foolish. Inside, Jasmine packed her papers calmly, while Melania whispered tightly with her lawyers. Two women, two different kinds of strength, staring down history. But as powerful as Jasmine's testimony was, the real twist hadn't arrived yet. It was coming in the form of a witness no one expected, someone who would flip the trial in less than 10 seconds. By the third week, the case felt deadlocked. Melania's team painted Jasmine as reckless. Jasmine's lawyers hammered the free speech angle. Reporters called it a coin toss. But that morning, rumors buzzed in the benches. The defense had a surprise. When the judge asked if the defense had more witnesses, Garvey stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. We would like to call Mr. Robert Klein." Reporters flipped through their notes. The name didn't ring a bell. Then a tall man in his mid-50s rose and walked to the stand. The entire room shifted. A few gasped. Others bent toward each other, whispering furiously. Robert Klein wasn't a celebrity name, but political junkies knew him. He had been in the shadows of Trump-era projects, including one infrastructure deal that critics had been questioning for years. Melania's lawyers tensed instantly. One leaned close to her ear, whispering fast. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Across the aisle, Jasmine folded her arms and let a faint smile curl at the corner of her lips. Klein raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat. His posture was straight, his face calm, his tone steady. Garvey stepped forward. "Mr. Klein, could you explain your role in the previous administration?" "I was a senior advisor on project negotiations, especially international contracts," he answered. Every word was measured but heavy. "And in that role," Garvey continued, "did you ever interact with the First Lady?" Melania's lawyer jumped up. "Objection! Irrelevant!" Garvey didn't blink. "Your Honor, this speaks directly to the credibility of the plaintiff's claims." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Overruled. Proceed." Klein adjusted his tie. "Yes, she was in several closed-door meetings. She didn't just sit quietly. She spoke. She gave advice. And sometimes she pushed deals forward." The air snapped silent. A reporter's pen hit the wooden bench with a clatter that sounded way too loud. Melania's face tightened. Garvey leaned in. "To be clear, you're saying the First Lady was directly involved in negotiations that were hidden from public view?" "Yes," he replied. "Just one word. But it landed like a bomb. 9 seconds. That's all it took. Reporters scrambled, fumbling with laptops and phones. Jurors shot glances at each other, pens flying. Gasps rippled through the benches. "Objection!" Melania's lawyer barked. "This is hearsay, unfounded." But it was too late. The image of Melania as a detached, apolitical first lady had just shattered. Garvey didn't press further. She didn't need to. Silence worked better than questions. Klein sat steady, unbothered, as if a truth he had carried for years was finally set free. The judge cleared his throat. "The jury will decide how much weight to give this testimony." His words were formal, but his eyes betrayed it. He knew something seismic had just happened. Melania turned quickly to her attorneys, whispering. One scribbled furiously on a pad. Another sneaked a worried look toward the jurors. Jasmine leaned back, arms crossed, face blank, but her aides behind her exchanged small, victorious smiles. She didn't need to gloat. The witness had done it for her.
Minutes later, recess was called, and chaos erupted. Reporters bolted for the doors, phones glued to their ears. "We need that clip," one shouted. Another muttered, "That's it. That's the moment." Outside, courthouse steps turned into a media riot. Microphones shoved in every direction, cameras crowding. A bombshell witness claims Melania Trump was directly involved in secret negotiations, one correspondent said breathlessly into a live feed. If true, this undercuts her entire case against Representative Jasmine Crockett. Inside, Melania sat rigid, staring straight ahead, her polished mask intact, except for the faint tremor in her hand gripping a pen. Jasmine didn't cheer, but her eyes said it all. For weeks, she had been painted as reckless, accused of making things up. Now, under oath, an insider had confirmed she wasn't reckless at all. She was right. But the shockwave wasn't confined to the courtroom. The real explosion was brewing outside, in the court of public opinion. 9 seconds. That's all it had taken for the trial to tilt like a wrecking ball from one side to the other. She was present, she gave input, she advocated for terms. That single line, spoken with icy calm, knocked down the carefully built image of Melania Trump as detached from power. For jurors, it was enough to shake everything they thought they knew. For the public, told for years she was above politics, it felt like betrayal. For Jasmine, it was vindication. The silence stretched long after Klein's words, heavy enough to choke the air, until the judge finally broke it. "We'll proceed with cross-examination," he said, though his tone lacked its usual firmness. Philip Ransom shot up, determined to claw back control. His stride was sharp, but sweat glistened at his collar. "Mr. Klein," he began, voice clipped, "you're suggesting the First Lady had influence in high-level negotiations. Do you have documents to back this up?" "I have notes from several meetings. Emails as well." Ransom's jaw tightened. "So you're telling this court that the First Lady, whose role is traditionally ceremonial, was acting as a negotiator?" "I'm saying," he replied without blinking, "she was more than ceremonial." Klein's answer came calm and steady. "She played a role. Whether that role was proper or not, that's for others to decide." The gallery gasped. One reporter mouthed to another, "This is the story." Melania's face looked stone still, but those seated nearby noticed her fingers digging into her pen so hard the plastic bent. Across the aisle, Jasmine leaned toward Garvey and whispered, "That's it. That's the moment." Garvey nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving Klein. Ransom tried to rattle him. "You left under difficult circumstances, didn't you, Mr. Klein?" "I resigned because I disagreed with certain practices," Klein replied evenly. "And you've criticized the Trump administration publicly since then, correct?" "I've spoken about issues I felt the public deserved to know." "So you've got an axe to grind," Ransom shot back. Klein leaned forward, his voice sharp but calm. "I have nothing to grind, Mr. Ransom. I came here to tell the truth. What people do with that truth, that's up to them." It was over. The jury didn't just hear the words. They watched how he said them. Steady, unflinching. Nothing Ransom threw could undo it. The judge finally called a recess, but the room didn't relax. It erupted. Reporters dashed out, aides whispered into phones, the whole place humming like a beehive. Outside, chaos exploded. "Today's testimony may have changed the entire case," a CNN reporter declared live. "A Trump-era advisor has testified under oath that Melania Trump was directly involved in secret negotiations she has long denied."
Reactions across the country came fast. On talk radio, callers fumed, some blasting Klein as a traitor, others insisting Jasmine had been right all along. Cable networks ran split screens, Crockett walking out steady and confident, Melania rushing away behind dark shades and her lawyers. At a diner in Tulsa, truckers shook their heads at the TV. "Man, never thought she was in it like that," one muttered. "They all are," his buddy replied. "They just hide it better." For Jasmine, Klein's 9 seconds were more than a win. They were a gift. That evening, clips of her calm reaction played on repeat, cut against Melania's tight-lipped silence. Analysts called it the turning point, not just of the trial, but of Jasmine's career. Back in her office that night, the defense team replayed the clip again and again. 9 seconds, Garvey said quietly. That's all it took. Jasmine leaned back, exhaustion showing, but her eyes burned with resolve. They thought dragging me in here would break me. Instead, it broke their story. Those 9 seconds tipped history's scales, and the fallout outside the courtroom was even louder than the testimony inside. Within minutes, Klein's line was clipped, subtitled, and blasted worldwide. Anchors slowed it down frame by frame. Analysts parsed every syllable. Hashtags exploded across Twitter and TikTok. The Dallas courthouse was pandemonium. Reporters swarmed hallways, shouting questions. "Do you believe the First Lady lied?" one barked at an analyst. Protesters slammed against barricades, police doubling their presence. In Melania's private room, the mood was grim. She sat pale but composed. "We need to control this," she said softly, ice in her tone. Ransom wiped his brow. Control is gone. The moment he said it under oath, it became fact in the public's mind. We can fight the evidence, but the damage is already done. Across the hall, Jasmine's team buzzed. Aides huddled over laptops. Garvey paced. Jasmine sat calm, arms folded, a tiny smile tugging at her lips. "I told them," she murmured, "you don't drag me into court unless you're ready to face the truth." The impact spread everywhere. At a Dallas cafe, customers hushed as the trial played on TV. "She was supposed to be untouchable," a woman muttered. "Nobody's untouchable anymore," her friend replied. In Washington, Republicans scrambled to defend Melania, calling Klein a bitter ex-staffer. Democrats pounced. "Representative Crockett has been vindicated," one declared on Capitol Hill. "This was never about truth. It was about intimidation, and it just backfired." Online, the contrast went viral. Clips of Jasmine striding from the courthouse carried captions like "fearless" and "truth doesn't bow." Videos of Melania leaving under heavy guard, her face behind sunglasses, trended with hashtags hinting at secrecy and scandal. Late-night shows had a field day. When your 9-second cameo destroys the First Lady's case, you deserve a medal or at least a Netflix special. The audience roared. But inside the jury room, the mood was sober. Their notebooks showed it. Words underlined truth, credibility, control. Klein's 9 seconds had stuck deep. Melania's defenders weren't silent. Outside, a woman waved a "Stand with Melania" sign. "This is character assassination," she said, voice trembling. "They're dragging her name because she's strong and graceful." Her words were drowned by chants of "Crockett, Crockett." That night, Jasmine skipped the victory parties. Back in her modest Dallas apartment, she sat at her kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear. "I don't feel like I won," she told her sister quietly. "I feel like the country just saw a curtain pulled back. Now everyone has to decide what to do with what they saw." Her sister's voice steadied her. "You stood your ground, Jazz. People saw it. They'll remember you didn't bend." Melania, meanwhile, retreated deeper into silence. No statements, no cameras, only her attorney speaking. But in that silence, a louder truth rang. Her gamble had cracked. By the next morning, the narrative was cemented. What was meant to muzzle Jasmine had amplified her instead. The trial was no longer about defamation. It was about truth, power, and the price of trying to use courts as weapons. When the final week began, the courthouse felt more like a stage than a hall of law. Outside, crowds debated fiercely. Students argued with retirees. Families leaned over food truck lunches, asking the same question. Was this about truth, or was it about power? Inside, closing arguments sharpened the story. Ransom stood tall, voice booming. You cannot let public officials speak recklessly about private citizens, even if that citizen is the First Lady. Words matter. Reputations matter. If we blur that line, no one is safe. He gestured toward Melania, sitting still, hands folded, gaze lowered. Then Garvey rose. She didn't use the podium. She walked straight to the jury, heels tapping softly. "This isn't about reputations," she said firmly. "It's about punishing truth." Congresswoman Crockett asked questions millions were already whispering, and when those questions cut too close, the response wasn't to answer, it was to silence. That's not justice, that's not democracy. She let silence linger. Then, if a congresswoman can be dragged into court for doing her job, what does that mean for the rest of us? What does it mean for your right to speak freely, for your right to demand honesty? Jasmine's eyes held steady on the jury. She wasn't smiling or angry, just present. Deliberations stretched long. Reporters paced the hallways, supporters huddled in prayer or strategy. Then finally, the buzzer sounded. A verdict. The jury foreperson rose, paper trembling in her hands. "We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Representative Jasmine Crockett." The words cracked like a whip. Jasmine's supporters cheered softly before the judge's gavel slammed for order. Melania sat frozen, her mask unbroken, but in her eyes flickered the truth. Her case had collapsed. Jasmine exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. She didn't gloat. She just closed her eyes a moment, as if to say, "I held the line." Outside, chaos again. Celebration and outrage in equal measure. Jasmine spoke briefly. "This wasn't about me," she told the microphones. "It was about the right to speak, to ask hard questions, to demand honesty. If we give that up, we give up our democracy." Her words echoed nationwide. Editorials praised her courage. Even critics admitted she'd stood firm. Melania stayed silent, her lawyers mumbling about considering options. But the story had been written and not in her favor. In living rooms, families debated. Some said no one, not even a first lady, should be above scrutiny. Others worried about eroding respect for public figures. But nearly all agreed this case forced America to confront the line between free speech and reputation. The moral wasn't just legal, it was human. Words do matter. They can cut, they can heal, they can define legacies. But silencing words out of fear is more dangerous than facing them. Jasmine's victory wasn't just hers. It reminded America that truth, however messy, is worth protecting. In a nation built on voices, courtrooms, Congress, street corners, the greatest threat isn't what's spoken, the danger is when voices are muted. So when Jasmine walked slowly down the courthouse steps that final day, cameras flashing, reporters yelling, she didn't rush. She walked steady, deliberate, like someone who understood the weight of it all. And whether you admired her or despised her, one fact couldn't be denied. She had stood against power, and power blinked first. The trial ended, but the lesson stayed. Never underestimate the strength of truth spoken aloud, even when it rattles the walls of power.